Welcome to Devotionary, where we make the Bible accessible and applicable. What happens when the people of God fail to seek the will of God? Nothing good. And that conclusion is fully supported in 2 Samuel 21, verses 1 through 14, where we have the story of a severe famine in the land of Israel. This devastating natural disaster had been going on for 3 full years. And eventually, David decided to seek God in order to determine whether it was a form of divine punishment. And David would discover that the famine was directly tied to a sin Saul had committed years earlier. He had broken a covenant Joshua had made with the Gibeonites, putting some of them to death. The book of Joshua makes it clear that the Israelites had not sought God's will in the matter. And Saul's decision to kill some of the Gibeonites was also done outside the will of God, breaking the covenant commitment and reflecting poorly on God, because the oath the Israelites had sworn had been before the Lord and in His name. These closing chapters of the book of 2 Samuel function as a kind of appendix, presenting 6 unrelated stories and in no chronological order, but intended to provide us with an historical overview of the life of David. The first involves a famine, which probably took place early in David's reign. It had lasted 3 years and brought much devastation to the people of Israel. But it wasn't until David sought the face of God that he became aware of the cause of the famine. It's significant to note that early in David's reign, he seemed to have been more prone to seek the face of God when faced with a difficulty. But he had still waited 3 years to ask God what was going on, and God told him. The famine has come because Saul and his family are guilty of murdering the Gibeonites. 2 Samuel 21, verse 1. Now, before we move on in the story, it's important that we look back at how all of this happened. All the way back in Joshua chapter 9, we're told of an incident concerning the people of Israel as they were attempting to take possession of the land of Canaan, promised to them by God. Joshua was approached by some Gibeonites, disguised as weary travelers and presenting themselves as representatives of a distant nation. They were seeking to make a treaty with the Israelites. The Gibeonites, who were actually local occupants of the land, had heard what Israel had done to the cities of Jericho and Ai, and knew they were next. So they had come up with a plan to deceive the Israelites into making a treaty with them, and it worked. But what's important to note is that it worked because Joshua did not ask counsel from the Lord. Joshua 9, verse 14. Instead, he signed a treaty with the Gibeonites, vowing not to attack them. Even when the Israelites discovered that they had been deceived, they could not do anything about it because they had sworn to them by the Lord, the God of Israel. Joshua 9, verse 18. Why is this even important? Because it reveals a powerful lesson regarding the danger of the people of God failing to seek the wisdom and direction of God. We've seen over and over again what happened to David when he failed to seek God. It never ended well. And this incident with the Gibeonites is yet another reminder that failure to seek God may not have immediate consequences, but it will inevitably come back to haunt you. Years later, when Saul had become king of Israel, he broke the very same covenant with the Gibeonites by killing some of them. The details of this incident are not recorded in the book of 1 Samuel, but David does not attempt to dispute that it happened. First of all, because it was God who had said that it had happened. Secondly, because the Gibeonites had confirmed it. There's little doubt that Saul had not sought the will of God when he had committed this violation of the covenant. And his sin was now having its inevitable consequences. As a result, David was forced to put 7 of Saul's sons to death as a form of retribution and in order to satisfy the demands of the Gibeonites. The famine would not end until this situation was made right and justice was served. But one of the lessons we must take away from this story is the residual nature of our sins. Joshua had failed to seek God and had made a covenant that went directly against the will of God. God had commanded the complete destruction and elimination of the occupants of the land. No treaties were to be made, and Joshua's failure to listen to God would leave the Gibeonites in the land. Then Saul would end up putting some of them to death, breaking the covenant Joshua had made with him. And then the people of Israel would suffer through a 3-year famine, all because Saul had violated a treaty with the Gibeonites, sworn before God himself. One sin had led to another. And then David had been left with the unpleasant task of having to remedy the whole situation by having 7 men put to death. Sin always has consequences. What can easily be overlooked in this story are the thousands of innocent people who suffered from the famine. Many had probably lost loved ones due to starvation. Innocent children suffered, Animals died. The entire community was forced to go through 3 years of God-ordained punishment because of the sins of 2 men. And we see the sorrow of Rizpah, one of the mothers of the slain men, as she stays beside the bodies, mourning their deaths and protecting them from scavengers. Her grief was the direct result of someone else's sin. And the story comes to a conclusion with David gathering the bodies of the 7 slain sons of Saul, along with the bones of Saul and Jonathan, and burying them all in the land of the Gibeonites. Saul and Jonathan had also died as a result of sin against God. Saul deserved what happened to him, but Jonathan was yet another innocent casualty of sin's devastating impact. Time and time again in the Scriptures, we see the latent and lingering influence of sin. It has a long shelf life. Our sins can be forgiven, but their consequences can last for generations. That's why it's so important that we seek the Lord. It's when we fail to seek Him and leave ourselves vulnerable to our own sin natures and the influence of the enemy that we risk doing those things that come back to haunt us. We tend to wrongly assume that our sins are personal and harm no one but ourselves. But the Scriptures are full of sobering stories like this one that prove that conclusion painfully wrong, dead wrong.